Well, hey, Eli, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Will.
Well, Eli, thanks for coming on. I wanted to get started and just ask you, could you give us a short bio and just tell us a little bit about what you're about and what your mission is?
Sure. Yeah. One way I sometimes start the story is about 15 years ago. I thought I wanted to be an economics professor, and so I went down that path and started a PhD at George Mason, um, and loved being at George Mason, but decided that actually like no, this was like a really bad plan to be a professor. So kind of pumped the brakes on that one and instead got into more of the policy world. Basically just have always been really interested in technology and you know the policy issues that relate to it, but also just the technology itself. And ended up taking a job at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University and working on tech policy full time. So it was pretty much a great match, and ended up running that department for a few years, and then leaving to go to Boom for a few years as a supersonic startup as the first policy hire, um, and did that for a few years, and then left in 2019 and took a few months off, and then ended up at the Center for Growth and Opportunity, where I am now, and it's been great. And in terms of my mission, so like at no point in this whole process have I known like what I'd be doing 5 years down the road,
Got
or
it.
been right about what I would be doing 5 years down the road. So I don't know about a master plan or anything like that. I don't think that's been in the cards. But
Right.
I like technology, and I like making things go faster. So basically, that's what I'm working on. I'm trying to accelerate economic growth through uh, moving technology forward.
Excellent. And if I just from my perspective, which I don't really know you. I know your work, just reading your blog and following you on Twitter and stuff. I would say it seems like you're really focused on how do we solve this tech stagnation problem in the West in particular.
Yeah,
You think that that's a fair reading?
yeah, totally. Yeah. So Tyler Cowen was my PhD advisor, and he wrote the book The Great Stagnation. And like, yeah, that's what I want to. That's kind of my research agenda now is ending the Great Stagnation and moving things forward.
Awesome. And could you just describe what the great stagnation is, what tech stagnation is, and then some potential solutions, perhaps?
Sure. So the way that one of the ways that Tyler defined it in his book, The Great Stagnation, is through looking at total factor productivity, right? So total factor productivity is this sort of economic concept of, once you've accounted for all the labor and capital in the economy, like if you're getting more one year versus another, that's due to something else that isn't measured, right? And that something else is, technology or quality of institutions or something like that. And what's interesting is that we see over time, if you look back from the late 1940s, which is when we started to have like modern economic data, like through the early 1970s, it was growing at about 2% per year, this total factor productivity. And then around 1973 or so, that stopped. It went to like about 0.5% per year, and then you know brief spurt in the sort of like late 90s, et cetera, from the tech boom, perhaps. And then in the like mid 2000s, it just fell off a cliff. And it's basically very the shell of its former self. It's like, growing at about 0.2, 0.3% per year over the last 15 years. So really slow total factor productivity growth. And so one of the ways I think about the Great Stagnation is like, can we get it to show up, like, growth again to show up again in that statistic, um, you know, growth that isn't accounted for by just like more people entering the workforce. And that happened, by the way, right in the 1980s, like a bunch of women who weren't working
Right.
before, like were working, right? And so you can get more output if you work longer hours. That's
Right.
not necessarily what we want. We want more productivity in the hours that we work. So yeah, once TFP starts growing really fast, like that's when I'll be like, okay, the Great Stagnation is over.
Got it. And I tend to think, just for the listeners, and Eli, I'd love to hear your feedback. I tend to think a lot of our political problems are downstream from this, and that increasing polarization is kind of a symptom of the fact that the pie is not getting bigger as fast as it used to. So it's like there's less to divvy up to particular interest groups to make everybody happy. I don't know.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Maybe it cuts both ways. So I think that like what you're explaining is like for most of human history, right? We've grown up in this zero sum economy, right? For hundreds of thousands of years, humanity had a zero sum economy, right? Like the only
Yep.
way you could get more stuff is if you take it from someone else, right?
Right.
And so economic growth breaks that equation. Like we can all get wealthier over time. And so when you get to a world where there is technological stagnation, then you're back to that zero sum world.
Right.
And like all of our worst instincts, all of our most destructive instincts come out. At the same time, it may be the case that it's primarily cultural changes that are if you want to think about what's the root cause of this, I think that sort of like the proximate cause is a lot of policy stuff, which is why I'm interested in the policy questions. But if you want to think, well, what's the root cause behind all these policy shifts? Maybe it's culture as well. And so that's something I'm toying with now is why what really is the root cause here, and noodling on that.
That's really well put. What do you think some of the root causes are? So you mentioned, maybe policies have changed. It does seem to me, at least, that I get the sense. I wasn't around in the New Deal, but I've got so I got a great uncle who's 95, so he's like on the tail end of that, and he used to talk. He always talks about how things used to. It seemed like things worked a lot better. So. And when I think about the New Deal, I think of like all the smart people going to Washington, founding all these institutions from scratch. And maybe there's just like this entropy in organizations, and they just start to work less well over time. The bureaucrats kind of take over, and they get farther away from their original mission. Now, I don't know. It depends. If you're more libertarian, you're probably skeptical that it ever really worked very well. But we were able to do Manhattan in this like crazy amount of time. But now the Department of Energy just like really sucks from where I'm sitting. I don't know. What do you think?
In terms of like what's the root cause, right? Like the cultural cause or something like that. So what I've been kicking around is an idea that humans have always been sort of like status seeking, right? And we care a lot about our status. If you were even in that zero sum economy, that we evolved in, right? If you were the tribesman that like killed the biggest animal and
right.
you slaughtered the mammoth, and your tribe could take a week off and like just have a festival, and like you were the man, right? Like you got tons of praise and stuff like that. And so we've always been very status conscious. We were evolved for that. You could think about like in the world before mass media.
Yeah.
That status mostly played out at the scale of like your neighborhood or your town or whatever. And so like that status competition, right, it's like relatively small in scope, right? It's like the disagreements aren't that big, right? You hate your neighbor because they have like a slightly nicer car than you, and there's not really like a culture war that comes out of it, right? It doesn't occupy your thoughts as so much, right? And then you add mass media to the mix, and you can think of the internet as like pouring rocket fuel on mass media.
Got it.
And we're all like focused on this more national or maybe even global culture war, and it becomes like the differences become so stark, and where it's all encompassing, and we whereas before it like occupied a small part of your brain, but for the most part like you're still cared about material progress. Like now it's like occupying your whole brain, and then like every policy change that is suggested, you have to think about it first in terms of like, well, whose status goes up and whose status goes down with this change, right? Like if we're going to reform the postal service, right, like whose status goes up and whose status goes down? Or if we're going to like reform education, like, well, is that lowering the status of teachers? And so on. And so like people react, I think, negatively to um, to some of these like zero sum, like that's the other thing is like status is zero sum,
Right.
like almost by definition, right? If
Inherently.
you're
Yeah.
raising, if you're, or at least at the level of, the policy change is coming in and changing things, it's going to raise the status of some people and lower the status of other people. And like, that's like our monkey brains basically reacting violently to it. And like nothing good can happen anymore.
Got it. Interesting. So it's something like it used to be if we both lived in a small town, you could be the best physician, I could be the best attorney, and we could all find our own like niche. But now you're competing against 8 billion people or something like that, and it's suddenly much worse in that sense, like harder to
Or
find a
it's like
place.
it's like maybe it's like you're a physician, I'm a physician, and we hate each other, and like
Like whatever.
we like want to be the best and
Yeah.
whatever, and we're competing for status within our local community. But for the most part, like that's pretty small, like
Small potatoes.
a small thing in my mind, right? And I really care about getting new cars and
Got it.
new TVs and whatever the technology of the time was that people wanted to have. Like they still really cared about progress, about material progress,
Got it.
because they're not like the culture war is not all encompassing, right?
It doesn't feel
It's like
so
little
vivid.
skirmishes at the level of the neighborhood where you like actually like mostly agree with the other person on most questions because they live near you and they're pretty similar.
Got it.
That's pretty different than like all the other questions that we get confronted with
Right,
today.
right. So, what do you have any thoughts about a way out of this? It seems like just kind of like almost inbuilt, right? Like it's like,
Right.
well, unless you just go blow up the internet or something, it doesn't go away.
Yeah. So I think that I think the only way that I can think of is like sort of hard fought policy changes that that like working through sort of the actually more proximate causes of the stagnation, so that
Got it.
um the so that's why I focus where I do. I'm not going to fix the culture.
Right.
And but
Much more difficult
I
than
can
that.
do a deep dive on a particular policy issue and convince a bunch of people that maybe it's the right solution for this problem and make things a little bit better. And so maybe through that process we can get growth moving again.
Got it. And I want to talk a lot about those policy changes, but I actually have a kind of tactical question. What does that look like? Is it just calling congressmen and just like and educating them about how better to? Is it calling bureaucrats within the federal agencies like, hey, this would be better policy to create? What does that look like? Like, what is an effective kind of strategy? And I know people do this because lobbying seems to be effective. People pay for it, so
I think that it varies by the issue, and
gotcha.
it's like you have to be very. Like a lot of it's not so much a strategy as like very tactical, a lot of tactical awareness and a
Gotcha.
lot of thinking about like where are the opportunities. Lobbying like does work, but it's interesting the mechanism by which it
Yep.
works, right? It works because the staffers don't have bandwidth, right, to like
Oh,
know about
really?
all these things, right? So it's like educating the staffer on like you're not persuading a member of Congress who doesn't agree with you to agree with you.
Right.
You're it's called legislative subsidy is the model that's sometimes talked about here. That what you're actually doing is like you're finding a member of Congress who would agree with you if they had the information, or like already agrees with you but doesn't have the information to back up in a deep way, and then
Got it.
you're providing them with the information. Like that's like the model that actually works, is that because the offices are pretty small and so on. But I focus a lot on just convincing elites, right? I think that there aren't, like, first of all, we need to agree that we are stagnating, right? And like there's
That's
people
important.
who
That's
don't
right.
agree with that, right? and
I
and
forget
so
that.
so sort of like just convincing people like this is a problem that we need to like address, and it's really bad, I think is an important piece of it. So I think a lot of what I do is not really for policymakers. It's for people adjacent to policymakers
Got it.
who will sort of like affect the culture of um, policy adjacent people, right? So that
Right.
they um, so they all sort of internalize the idea, okay, there is stagnation, there is stuff we can do, like there's like concrete technologies that need to be moved forward, and we need to find solutions to make that happen.
Got it. In what ways, I want to zoom out a little bit. In what ways has policy failed, and prevented a lot of innovation? Is it just, I've heard you mention the NEPA legislation.
NEPA, yeah.
NEPA, yeah. So what does that look like? I don't know.
So NEPA is it's, to me, it's my favorite villain, right? Because it's just so atrocious, like what it does. So there's a law that was passed in 1969, I guess took effect January 1st, 1970. And it basically said, we care about the environment. That's like Congress had a statement that said, we care about the environment. And before any agency of the federal government takes any major action that could affect the human environment, it's required to produce a detailed statement of like what the effects could be. Right. So no actual protection in this.
You just have to do a report.
You have to do a report. Right. And say what it would be. Now, I mean, so there's a few things. So like one is that like major actions by a federal agency has been interpreted to mean everything. Right. Every action. Oh, really? So like, yeah, like any action you want to do that could affect the human environment has to go through a report. And then basically, if you want to also say that you don't affect the human environment and therefore you shouldn't have to do this report, you have to do another report to prove that.
Oh, really?
Right. So it's like the report that Congress like wrote about that you have to do if you are affecting the human environment is called an environmental impact statement. And then this other report that you could do to show that you have no effect on the human environment is called an environmental assessment, and so you have to do that if you don't want to do the environmental impact statement and show that you have no effect. And so the environmental impact statement takes varying amounts of time, but like an average of something like 5 years to do.
God. Jesus.
Right, and then the environmental assessment is like 1 to 2 years.
Gotcha.
Probably about 2 years typically. And both of these, with the regulations that have implemented NEPA, right, that have sort of done this, like have created like long drawn out processes where there have to be public meetings, and you have to like and you have to do this. So these documents, like the environmental impact statements, can be like hundreds, or like with appendices and stuff, thousands of pages long. Jesus. Right. You have to have public meetings to hear about this. And and like when you get to the end of the process, the government can still say, like, we know that this has bad effects for the environment, but we're going to do it anyway. Right. There's no like substantive environmental protection here.
It's just paperwork.
It's popular with the law is popular with environmental attorneys, right? Sort of like activist attorneys, because you can stop any project by like suing on these grounds, or many projects by suing on these grounds. Like the environmental assessment wasn't carefully done enough, right? Or the environmental impact statement didn't consider this, and you can get a court to like come in and say, okay, we're going to send this back to the agency, and they have to do a better one, right?
Jesus.
So it's really bad.
It's like this huge roadblock. Anybody can just throw up.
It is a massive roadblock. It's like basically like NIMBYism, times a million. So it slows down projects, and you can't do any of the work on the project until this is done, right? You're not allowed to like commit any resources to it, like in terms of like putting a shovel in the ground. You can't start digging. Maybe you can't, you're going through an environmental impact statement for one element of the project. You're not allowed to like assume success of the environmental impact statement.
Oh God.
Of the decision at the end before you start doing it. So basically, I think about like an investor, right? So the other thing I should say is the law as written applies to federal agencies, but it also applies to any federal action, right? So it's the decision the decision to approve a permit.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Oh, Jesus.
So by a private company. So the private company says, like, we want, so a great example is what the Boring Company is doing between DC. They're building a tunnel between DC and Baltimore. It's super cool. Like, it'll take you, in 15 minutes from DC to Baltimore or vice versa, in an autonomous electric car, underground, no traffic.
It's awesome.
Like, it sounds great, right? And super cheap. For the Boring Company to do that, they're going to the Park Service, I think, and they're saying, we want to do it under the Baltimore Washington Parkway. That's where we're going to do it in that right of way. And so the government has to say yes or no to that question, and that the act of saying yes to that is considered a major federal action. Right.
Jesus.
And so then, like, the Boring Company has to go through all the expense of producing essentially I guess it's the Park Service's report. But like, the Boring Company has to do it, and like, they have to shepherd it through the process to get it approved, as if they were the federal agency almost, right? So this doesn't just affect the federal government. It basically makes our government very deliberately slow and stupid in terms of like being able to come to a decision quickly, and it creates opportunities for sabotage and opportunism. All the fights about like the Keystone XL pipeline, those are all like NEPA related. I mean, really? It's not actually like in the news coverage, but like, that's actually what they were fighting about, was the environmental impact statements and stuff like that.
Oh, wow.
So I think it's extremely damaging, and to like have this play out, but it's also like, by environmentalists, it's considered the Magna Carta of the environmental movement, and it is not going anywhere. So the best we can do is like little tweaks around the edges and maybe like slight reforms and stuff to try to get things moving faster. So that's why we're stagnating. It's like that plus several other things that are kind of like that.
Gotcha. And it does seem like it's just so frustrating, right? Because at the end of the day, you don't have to you just have to produce this report, right? And it seems like there'll be some sense, like, if we could get the environmentalists on board to actually have like, we're actually going to do something that's, it's much quicker process that actually, accomplishes your goals and gets us better outcomes on the environmental side, but also doesn't, destroy all our ability to do anything at all. It would be really positive. But
and you can weaponize this in so many ways. It doesn't have to be environmental. So I just saw a proposal from Viasat to put NEPA review on Elon Musk's or on SpaceX's low Earth orbit constellation, because Viasat operates a geosynchronous constellation, and they don't want the competition from the low Earth orbit people, right? So it's like you can like sabotage.
So you really can use it to just blow competitors out.
Yeah,
that's horrifying. Jesus. It's so interesting to me when there's huge things like that you go through college and all your civics classes and you've never even heard about it, and it's so important, right?
Right.
A big blocker.
Yeah, and I have a lot of friends who are like, oh, the reason we're stagnating is because basic science is less productive or whatever. It's like, no, I don't think that's the reason, guys. like it's this is much more fundamental.
Right. Yeah. It's really important. Have you ever, speaking of basic science, have you ever heard of Don Braben? This is an aside. In his book, Scientific Freedom. It was just re-released by Stripe Press a couple months ago.
Yeah. Heard of, but haven't read it. Yeah.
So he was talking about tech stagnation in the early 2000s. And he has this thesis. He ran a program at BP called Venture Research. He was a physicist. He has this thought that funding model switched around 1970, where you could, if you were a scientist in the university pre-1970, you could get like a little bit of money and just work on whatever you wanted to, and you had this complete freedom to like pursue whatever you want. But then that switched, and it has to be directed. And this is a great transition to the next question I have. And you have to spend all your time being a salesman, or half your time being a salesman for grants, and then that selects all the weird people out. You only get the salesman scientist, and there's all these selection effects. And also, the grant process is really messed up. Do you see any alternatives to the grant process? It seems to me like the grant prizes create this competition where you keep spending more and more to win the grant, until you spend up to the cost of the grant to try and win it. I see this a lot in education. It seems like it's like we're hire all these grant writers.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's, sort of the common solutions. There's like prizes. There's, different ways. Hand out more money and just don't ask a lot of questions,
Right.
and just see what the results are and stuff like that. I think we should have like a ton of experiments on that, but ultimately, at the end of the day, like it's not. I don't think it's the science, right? I think like when you think about like my Twitter account, right, is like full of science porn, right? Like I will like find some cool scientific study and I'll tweet about it and I'll be like excited about how great that scientific little mini breakthrough is or something like that. But like ultimately, it's got to translate to some sort of product, right? Exactly. For it to affect productivity, right? The same root word. It's you've got to have that sort of translation step of like we've taken this breakthrough and we've made it into we've come to market and you can now use this and at scale. Like if it's so I think about something like CRISPR,
right?
Huge scientific breakthrough. We still can't use it at scale. Like there's no approved treatments that use CRISPR yet, right? And we've awarded a Nobel Prize to the discoverers. And so I mean, like, so I favor a lot of experimentation in terms of like how we fund the science, but ultimately I think it's only going to get us so far because we're hamstringing the translation into mass market products.
It's not allowed. Yeah, that's really interesting, and that actually that I'm gonna run back a little bit. What does tweaking around the edges look like when you're working with something like NEPA? What can you do?
So there's a bunch of things. So one is we can do what the Trump administration did last year, which was they revised the NEPA implementing regulations.
Got it.
So there's these regulations that are housed in the Council on Environmental Quality, which is the White House office, and they basically state how agencies are supposed to comply with NEPA. And you can tweak those regulations to make them less burdensome or like quicker to do, or you can impose requirements in there, right? And so some of the requirements the Trump administration put in there are we're going to have a clock, right? Like you've got to do, if you have an environmental impact statement, you have 2 years to do it, and that's it. It's like 2 years. It's still a long time, but that's the but that's like one kind of tweak you can, and there's also some debate about what's the scope of all the effects, because as we all know from chaos theory, like everything affects everything else, right? Like a butterfly flaps its wings, it's like you could affect anything, right? So how long does this report have to be, right? And so actually like cabining the scope of that, and there's a lot of case law on this too, and so a lot of what the administration did was bring in the case law and like try to set definitions based on that. Still very mumuch opposed by the activists, but that regulation did go through. We'll see if the Biden administration wants to change it at this point, or if it gets, I don't know where the court challenges are. I'm sure there's court challenges to it. The other thing you can do is, one thing I'm thinking about is, and there's people in Congress thinking about it as well. Senator Lee, by the way, I should say, has introduced a bill called the Unshackle Act. That would address some finer points around NEPA, but one of the things that I would like to see is just reporting on like how many we pretty much know how many environmental impact statements the agencies are doing. How many environmental assessments are they doing? Right. I think the answer is tens of thousands.
Oh, Jesus.
Right, a year. Right. So maybe hundreds of, maybe 100,000 or something or more across the whole federal government. But we don't know. Nobody knows the answer to that question, as far as I can tell. And then when you look at the, if you had like a list of like, here are the 20,000 environmental assessments that we completed last year, like are 5,000 of them all like basically the same thing? And if
I
so,
see.
what you could do is you could require the agency to go through what's called a rulemaking to do what's called a categorical exclusion. And you could say, we have assessed like this set of facts, like
Gotcha.
these parameters, and as long as your project falls within these parameters, like we know the environmental effects of that, and we don't have to do a new study. And so they could go through rulemakings that sort of like reduce the amount of paperwork that they have to do in the future, or that
Got it.
people applying for permits and stuff. So I would like to see a lot more categorical exclusions and some sort of forcing mechanism to make agencies actually do those rulemakings.
Gotcha. That's really smart. It's a smart way to handle that and kind of work around the edges. Um, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some blog posts you've written before.
Sure.
Is America just too big? Do we need to break America up into smaller, chunks that are more manageable?
So probably we don't. I wrote that post the week, actually the week before Donald Trump was elected.
Oh, really?
Because I thought
Here we go.
I didn't publish it until after, but I wrote it before because I was just so horrified that Trump had gotten as far as he did. Right, it was a major.
This far.
And I saw like the sort of like just the cultural assumptions that were being made in different parts of the country and so on were just so different, and it seemed irreconcilable.
Right.
And so I Hillary won, or Trump won, and then I sat on it for a week and I said, okay, I'll still publish this and change the opening paragraph or whatever it was. And I think that the diagnosis is right, that we actually do have a lot of different cultures. Like we're actually, I think 11 cultures is what some people have said that are actually 11 distinct cultures in the US that are broken up geographically and so on. I think that's probably right, and that we shouldn't. It's not ideal that we're all having to like navigate, especially when you think about all the status stuff, right? Like we're raising and lowering like certain things in status, and if you come at it with different cultural assumptions, you're going to disagree on a lot of stuff, and it creates a lot of unnecessary conflict. And so I think that diagnosis is right. In terms of breaking up the country, like I think I even in that post wasn't really coming out in favor of that, but I've come to even more since then say like, well, that's not really a good answer either. And a lot of the reason is just geopolitical. Like I see like what would happen to the world? Man, if the US fell apart, like the world would be screwed, right? Like, I mean, you think about the security services that we provide, for the globe, essentially.
Right.
So I don't see it as a good solution, but I do see it as like still like a pretty good diagnosis.
Gotcha. Yeah, it also seems to me like the primary cultural distinction is between urban and rural now. So there's even if when you even think about it, it's just like it doesn't geographically make any sense. But yeah, it is interesting that we do have these problems. It's like no one seems to ever talk about their local governance issues anymore at all. It's all about like what's going on in Washington. It's like you hate the people on the other side of you at the national level, and at the local level, it's just like you don't even think about it. Yeah, don't even think about it at all. It's really weird, really, really odd. Should we care about aviation innovation? I know planes have been getting slower. I love the Concorde when I was a kid. I thought it was the coolest thing ever.
Yeah,
never got to fly on it because they got rid of the darn thing. What happened there, and what can we do to speed that up? I know people are finally working on that. You've worked on that a little bit.
So I mean, actually, I spent 2.5 years of my life at a startup working on this. So aviation has absolutely stagnated, right? It's, if you look in the sky today, it's all tube and wing designs for airliners. Actually, the stagnation is even more obvious in general aviation. Like the small,
we can't even keep the 737s in the air anymore.
Well, there's that. But I'm thinking about like the two-seater planes, the four-seater planes, right? The small private pilots, stuff. Like those are designs from World War II, essentially, right? Like they're basically small tweaks, right? New avionics and so on. But like, but basically like pretty similar to late World War II or early post-war era, there were a lot of people who came back from World War II, and had pilots, the ability to pilot something,
Yeah.
like learned how to fly. And so people thought that was going to be like a big thing. It's like, well, we've taught all these people how to fly, and now we're going to have like this booming general aviation sector. And it's just declined. And the designs have gotten no better. And now maybe that's changing a little bit with the eVTOL designs,
Yeah.
for air taxis and so on. And then the airline stuff, a lot of it's hopefully changing soon with the supersonics and hypersonics. I was at Boom. They're pursuing a Mach 2.2 design. Maybe I don't know what the passenger number is now, but maybe like 60 passengers. Uh, you know, um, so 10% faster than Concorde, maybe a little smaller to make it more manageable, both from the economic side and from the manufacturing side. Um, and that you'd think with modern tools, right? So Concorde was designed on slide rules on paper with no computers, right? And wind
Right.
tunnels,
Yeah.
like every like with computational fluid dynamics, you can take a airplane design and test it in a few hours on
Yeah.
Amazon, the Amazon cloud, whereas 50 years ago, right, when they were designing Concorde, they would take a model and put it through a wind tunnel and get data back. It takes like 6 months,
Jeez.
right, to like study it. So it's like
Right.
they did Concorde using those
Right.
tools, right? And then aluminum versus carbon fiber, like it's just night and day. Like the Concorde would actually grow and shrink about 15 inches
Oh
over
God.
the course of a flight. So you have the exterior that grows, and the interior has to stay the
Jesus.
same size, and the whole thing has to be airtight, right?
Yeah.
Like it's like that's crazy. And so with carbon fiber, you don't have that as much of that problem. Um, so it should be a lot better today.
Right.
And but we still don't have it, right? And it's still going to be, I think Boom is forecasting entry into service at 2029. Aerion's doing a business jet at Mach 1.4. They're thinking like 2026. So like, and those are the earliest ones. So for the next 5 years, you can't get on a supersonic plane, right?
God.
Like, and we had Concorde. So there's just so much we could do. And you think about air taxis and flying around town, getting to the
Yeah.
other side of town in 5 minutes. If you live in a big city, is a big deal.
Yep.
And you could do a lot more safely than helicopters too, because helicopters are really dangerous.
Right. Yes.
So there's tons of stuff we could do. There's just autonomy in aviation is something I've been thinking a lot about lately, because everyone's focused on autonomous cars, but
Right.
actually roads are hard to be autonomous on. Like the sky is really easy.
That's
There's
true.
nothing up
There's
there,
nothing.
right? There's like, you have to avoid birds, right?
Yes.
You have to avoid like other planes who all have transponders,
Yep.
right? Like that's not so hard. And so like landing and takeoff, right? Maybe a little challenging, but not that hard. Like we have auto landing and auto takeoff systems
Right.
already. So like it's a much easier problem, but we're spending all our effort on cars. I think this is another regulatory issue, right? And everything on airplanes has to be certified before it comes to market.
Gotcha.
And everything on cars is, for the most part, it's you can do what you want, but then we might issue a recall, right? So it's like
Gotcha.
pre-market approval versus post-market surveillance, and that's like another way that we are, in aviation, we're kind of limiting innovation.
Got it. Is that a better model? Do you think in general, just switching to post-market surveillance versus,
I
just
would, yeah,
preventing kind of
I think it's a much better model in many cases. Maybe not for like, I don't know, nuclear reactors or something like that, but maybe even there.
Right.
But yeah, I think like in terms of like pharmaceuticals, right? Like
Right.
our tolerance for risk is way too low, and maybe it makes sense to like say, well, this drug hasn't been well studied, and you can take it if you want, and we're going to do surveillance on it, and you're going to report your results if you take it, and if it turns out to be bad, we're going to issue a recall and people are going to stop using it. That's not that much different from clinical trials where you have like informed consent of the participants and you're monitoring for data and so on. And so I think having that approach, it's a little riskier, but I think it balances type 1 and type 2 errors a little more. So like FDA is very concerned about making a type 1 error, but they don't care about making type 2 errors at all.
Can you talk about that?
Killing people?
Distinction? Yeah.
So like they don't want to. They care much more about approving an unsafe drug than they care about not approving a safe drug. Yes. Right. So if there's a drug that could save 1,000 lives, and the FDA just sits on it and doesn't approve it, that's not meaningfully different from the FDA killing 1,000 people by approving a drug that it shouldn't. Right. Like the same number of people die in the end. Right. It's the same.
Exactly.
And the FDA is very concerned with one type of error, but not with the other, because those are the incentives we've given them, right? So I would, like lots of talented people at the FDA. I want them to continue studying drug safety,
right?
But they could just do it in a post-market sense, where they're gathering data on, here's this patient that took this drug, and here was the outcome, and here were the adverse effects, and so on, and then forming a view over time, and then using that information to either inform the public or in some cases, issue a recall and say you can't use this drug anymore.
Right. Yeah. I think it's a great idea. And it's just so frustrating to me when we had the Moderna vaccine sometime in late March or something like that. And they sat on it because in 1974, the story goes, 1 in 100,000 people got Guillain-Barré and the swine flu vaccine, and the public health establishment is like, we don't want to go through that again. There's 1 in 100,000 people. We'll kill 200,000 people in the interim. We're fine with that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. We actually had the Moderna vaccine in January.
Even more horrifying. Sorry.
Yeah, but no, but I mean, even if you you would still have to test the dosing and stuff and figure out what's the right dose and so on. But yeah, I think just making it possible to for people to give informed consent at least and say like, I want to try this, right? Like, like I, the bioethicist Jessica Flanagan is really good at this on this issue. She wrote a book called Pharmaceutical Freedom, and it's like basically if you have if you believe in sort of the right of the patient to like determine the course of their own treatment and give informed consent, like it just follows very naturally from that you should let them, experiment with things that haven't been approved, or like you shouldn't put the government in between the doctor patient decision to pursue a treatment.
Right. Is America just? This brings the thought to me: is America too litigious? We allow people to just like, oh God, you approved this drug and then this bad thing happened, and maybe does that feed into it, or is that just not even?
I used to think like that was like a bigger piece of it, but maybe not, right? Maybe it's like it's not the lawsuits that people are worried about in this case. It's yeah, I mean, the government has qualified immunity, right? So it was like, like if the government approves a drug and it turns out to be unsafe, like you don't have recourse. So it's not like they're afraid of that. It's rather that I think that just we don't want to, like, we see the bad things like seem worse than the good things seem good, right? And so like it's just conservatism, I think, and sort of a mentality of conservatism, and yeah, why does it matter? Like, if something, as I said, like if the deaths are caused by approving a drug, versus not approving a drug, like intellectually we know that it's not as bad, but like emotionally, I think for people it seems worse to die from a drug that you thought was approved, approved and you thought was safe.
Got it. Are you down for a round of overrated, underrated?
Sure.
Okay, cool. And I've got this theory that if you're a big EMH believer, they're all like correctly rated, except for very rare circumstances. Got like
Okay.
special knowledge or something. Anyway, that's just my funny thesis for the day. So overrated or underrated? The Concorde.
I think really underrated. So of course, everybody. I think the sort of like, I would say, assess the conventional wisdom is like Concorde was a miracle of engineering for its time, but it was
Right.
like uneconomical. Like,
Yeah.
it crashed once, and so on. But I think what the conventional wisdom gets wrong is like, if Concorde existed today, it would still be profitable, right? So
Got it.
so if you think about the time that it in 2003 was when it retired,
Yeah.
and I remember looking at this data when I was at Boom. It was like, in the 15 years since then, right, from 2013 to 2018, premium business class transatlantic service, business and first class transatlantic service increased, I want to say more than doubled,
Oh wow.
in that period of time. So
Interesting.
so basically the problem that the Concorde suffered was that they couldn't fill the seats, right? And so
Right.
airline economics has this funny dynamic, which is that you if you charge one price and you can't fill the seats, you might be able to charge a lower price and fill more of the seats and make more money. The marginal cost of a additional passenger is actually zero, right? And so
Right.
being able to fill the seats at a potentially even a lower price would have made the whole thing a lot more profitable. And that would have made it possible for you to have more Concordes in service, because only 14 saw service.
Gotcha.
And if more of them were in service, then you would take care of the biggest problem that it had, which was maintenance costs. So
Gotcha.
it's like spare parts, right? Like,
Right.
if you have a fleet of 14 jets and you have to like create spare parts for them, that's really hard. If you have a fleet that's 100 times bigger, then it's a lot more manageable. It's a lot more scalable. So sort of my view is like, if Concorde, even as inefficient as it was by modern standards in terms of engines and materials, if it existed today, like, it would still work.
Nice. That's awesome. Bitcoin.
I think it's overrated by its proponents, but I think like the idea of blockchains in general is like still underrated by a lot of people. So Bitcoin is this weird thing where it's like, somebody, Satoshi invented like internet money.
Yeah.
And then like sort of people who were interested in it were basically two kinds of people who were interested in it. One was sort of like technical people who saw the technical achievement and were intrigued by it.
Yeah.
And really like hard money people, like gold bugs and stuff like that.
Right.
And like they like found each other on the internet and like so infected each other with their ideas.
Yeah.
And so basically like you have this like entire group of people who like Bitcoin and now are totally convinced that like sort of like hard money theories are correct. And they aren't. Very clearly they aren't.
No problem. Yeah.
And so I think it's unfortunate that it's become Bitcoin has become like such a strong meme, and like this right. sort of like limited supply and so on, like has become such a strong meme that it's hard to overcome. But Bitcoin is basically a meme coin at this point. It's valuable because of the Bitcoin meme, and there are other blockchains that are being developed to do more interesting things, and on which, by the way, you could implement something that is technically superior to Bitcoin, right? As a token or whatever, right? You could fix supply. You could just hard money as you want, and you could just do it as a token on another blockchain. But the Bitcoin meme has gotten very strong. But I think the idea, though, the core idea of blockchain is still very, very strong and very, very interesting. Like the idea of a logically unified but physically decentralized and therefore unstoppable resource, right, that the whole world can use is super interesting and valuable. And for things, so I spent a few years working on internet governance, and and like I was at the center of many fights over like the domain name system and stuff like
Yeah.
that. You
Interesting.
could just do the domain name system on a blockchain and like
Yeah.
be done with it, right? Like it's like you don't have to have you could have this sort of like centralized resource, logically
Right.
centralized, physically decentralized, and don't worry about like states coming in and overtaking it.
Definitely. It's really interesting. Yeah. My most interesting comment about Bitcoin is that 60 some odd percent of mining capability is in China. And if you know how good the PRC is at solving collective action problems and
Right.
coordinating things, you should be concerned about this currency that's supposed to be completely, abstracted away from governments.
Right.
Anyway,
Right.
um, the space launch system.
Oh man, it's poorly rated, but probably still overrated. Um, and the reason I'd say that is that like I think the conventional view is that it is uh it's a bad rocket, right?
Right.
It's like not high value for money. It's cost
Yeah.
$20 billion so
Yeah.
far. It should have cost like half of that or less. And whatever. But I think it's actually like potentially like really unsafe and like
Oh,
like
on top of that.
like I don't know. I'm worried about it. Like
Jesus.
we like the marginal cost of a launch, even after we've spent all the development dollars, the
Yeah.
marginal cost of a launch is still going to be in the billions.
Jesus.
And you think about SpaceX coming along with Starship, and it's launch cost is going to be something like I don't know, like Elon will throw out numbers like $1.5 billion for a Starship launch
Something
that can
comical.
take more
We can
to
pass the
space
hat
than
around
the
and
space launch
get
system.
there.
Right. So
Yeah.
it's. I mean, I don't know if it'll be that, but it'll be at least it'll be less than 50 million on
Yeah.
Starship, and so you're talking about a 20x capability
God.
reduction versus Starship on space launch system.
Jesus. What a mess. What a mess. One more. GMU Econ.
Oh well, I loved my time at GMU. I think they're still underrated. That department is phenomenal, and I think it's just interesting questions, interesting ways of thinking about the world that almost no one else is doing. And although maybe maybe I'll say like doing a graduate degree is overrated, right? Like people like I don't necessarily encourage everyone to go out and follow my path and get an econ PhD. But if you do it at GMU because
Place to be.
it's a great community of people.
Great. Well, Eli, thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find you? And do you have any parting thoughts?
So you can find me online on Twitter at Eli Dourado and on my website at elidourado.com. And my sort of professional work is at the Center for Growth and Opportunity, the CGO.org. Parting thoughts, man. This has been a great conversation. I think it's just so important that we actually get growth moving. And
Definitely.
we've talked about a number of ways that a number of reasons it's not happening, and now we have to find solutions.
That's great. Thanks, Eli.